What's going on, everybody? Yo, boy John here. I noticed while I was reading the first part that there was a decent amount of echo, some ambient noises, so I'm going to try and improve the quality a little bit by doing this all under a blanket. So I apologize for you visual people, but I'll pop out if there's any like cool picture that I need to show. But I guess this means that we're going audio only. Unless you want to see somebody under blankets and just like reading. But if you're into that type of stuff, then God help you. Well, I guess I should make sure that I'm still recording and that the audio levels look pretty good. I might up the audio level just a tad. Hopefully that works out just fine. Yup, we'll see how this goes. So here we go. Oops. Chapter 2. The Life. We know more about Beethoven than any composer who lived before him, and for that matter, a great many who have come since. The sheer quantity, I just realized I'm like reading over the mic. 1 second, I apologize for the noise. Alright, let me start over. We know more about Beethoven than any composer who lived before him, and for that matter, a great many who have come since. The sheer quantity of the historical record can seem overwhelming at times. The correspondence, more than 2,000 letters to and from him, extends across 6 hefty printed volumes. The document now known as the Heilgidstadt Testament, that word comes up a lot, so I'm gonna butcher that many times. Written 1802, but secreted away and not discovered until after his death, is a deeply personal and emotionally direct confrontation with the growing reality that he was losing his sense of hearing. In his many years, when his deafness had become severe, visitors often communicated by a combination of shouting and writing, and the 139 conversation books that have survived give us detailed insights into his daily concerns, with entries that range from the mundane to the metaphysical. The diary he kept sporadically between 1812 and 1818 records both philosophical and practical observations. Reminiscences of those who knew him personally fill 2 substantial volumes, and we have some 8,000 pages of musical sketches that range from brief melodic fragments to extensively drafted complete movements. These sketches allows us to trace the step-by-step growth of many of Beethoven's landmark compositions, along with countless others he abandoned. We also have to sort through reams of spurious evidence. The first biography published in Prague shortly after his death, and written by one Johann Alois Schlosser, an otherwise almost completely unknown figure, is full of inaccuracies. In the 1830s, the author Bettina Brentano von Arnim, who knew the composer, published a series of colorful but largely fabricated letters from him and about him. The words she put into Beethoven's mouth are often still repeated as if they were genuine. Anton Schindler, his personal assistant at various times toward the end of his life, published an I Knew Beethoven biography in 1840 that contains many dubious claims that grew more detailed in a later edition. Scholars have since discovered that Schindler forged entries in the conversation books to make his relationship with the composer seem both longer and closer than it actually was. The fiction surrounding Beethoven's life has consistently reinforced the image of the scowl, and it has taken on a life of its own. We cannot simply ignore it, for it has shaped the way generations of listeners have heard his music. The outlines of his life are nevertheless clear enough. Bonn, where he was born on December 16th or 17th, 1770, was not a large city, but there was nothing small about it. With a population of just under 10,000, it was the residence of the Archbishop Elector of Cologne. This was a position that was at once both clerical and political. From 1784 until 1794, Beethoven's formative years, Bonn's ruler was Maximilian Franz, the younger brother of the Habsburg Emperor Joseph II. Both brothers were sympathetic to many of the Enlightenment's ideals and encouraged that what was at the time was a relatively free flow of ideas. Maximilian Franz opened a portion of the palace's library to the public and played a key role in elevating the city center of learning to the status of a university. Bonn was also a musically active city, even before the arrival of the music-loving Maximilian Franz from Vienna. Beethoven's great-grandfather, also named Ludwig, was the court's music director and a prosperous businessman on the side. He had grown up in Mechlin, Malines, in what is now northern Belgium, hence the Van in the family name. But his only son, Johann, the composer's father, squandered his inheritance, suffered from alcoholism, and neglected his duties as a singer at the court. In 1767, Johann van Beethoven married Maria Magdalena Kevrich, a widow, and the couple had 7 children, 3 of whom survived infancy. Their 2 younger sons, Caspar Karl and Nikolaus Johann, would eventually follow their older brother to Vienna, but were not themselves musicians. How much older? To the very end of his life, Beethoven seems to have been confused not simply about the day on which he was born. Baptized on December 17th, he may have been born a day or even 2 days before, but the year was well. Some writers have blamed the confusion on his father, who may have tried to promote him as a child prodigy by shaving a year off of the boy's advertised age. Later in his life, Beethoven came to believe that he had actually been born in 1772, even in the face of documented and notarized evidence presented to him on more than one occasion. In any event, Johann von Beethoven recognized his oldest son's musical abilities early on and saw to it that he received instruction from a series of able teachers. The most notable of these was Christian Gottlieb Neff, who in a report on the musical scene in Bonn in 1783 described his young pupil as a promising talent, who had already published a set of keyboard variations. This young genius, Neff announced, deserves support that would enable him to travel, who would certainly become a second Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart if he were to make progress in the same way he has already begun. Beethoven was duly appointed deputy court organist in Bonn in June 1784, his first salaried position. He also played viola in the court orchestra and opera house, and in the process acquired first-hand knowledge of the contemporary repertory, most notably symphonies by Haydn and Mozart, and operas by Haydn, Mozart, Gluck, and Gretry. He was surrounded by an array of talented young musicians as well, figures who would go on to enjoy eminent careers of their own. These included the composer and theorist Anton Reka, as well as the violinist Andres Romberg and his cousin, the cellist Bernhard Romberg, both of whom were also composers. Nikolaus Simrock, a somewhat older horn player, would later establish what would become one of the continent's leading music publishing houses. Though his formal schooling ended sometime around the age of 10, Beethoven remained determined to educate himself throughout his life. He attended lectures at the university, read widely in fields beyond music, and years later would claim that, without making the slightest claim to actual book learning, there is no treatise that could be too learned for me, for from my youth onward I have taken pains to grasp the import of the better and wiser individuals of each age. Shame on any artist who does not consider it an obligation to do at least this much. But aspirations and accomplishments are 2 different things, and Beethoven remained painfully aware of his shortcomings in speaking, in writing throughout his life. He seems to have learned the use of uppercase letters only in adulthood, and he consistently struggled with numbers. The concept of multiplication eluded him altogether. In one of the conversation books, for example, we can see him adding the number 16 7 times instead of simply multiplying 16 times 7. The musical talent, on the other hand, was obvious to all early on. The Elector financed Beethoven's continued musical education in Vienna with the understanding that he would eventually return to service in Bonn. Maximilian Franz was himself a Mozart enthusiast, and no doubt saw in the youth the possibility of a second such genius. Indeed, Mozart himself commented in 1782 that the Elector-to-be, still in Vienna at the time, thrusts me forward on every occasion, and I can say almost with certainty that if he were already Elector in Cologne, I would also already be his music director. We can only wonder how the history of music would have unfolded if a few years later Mozart had indeed left Vienna for the Rhineland, where he would have met a 14-year-old Beethoven. When Maximilian Franz did finally arrive in Bonn in 1784, he found a well-entrenched musical director already in place. With an eye to his new court's musical future, and at the urging of Count Ferdinand Waldstein, one of his advisors, the Elector funded Beethoven's journey to Vienna. In a notebook Beethoven kept at the time, Waldstein wrote this remarkably prescient inscription in late October 1792. Dear Beethoven, you are going to Vienna to fulfill your long frustrated wishes. The spirit of Mozart's genius still mourns and weeps over a death of her pupil. It found refuge but no engagement with the inexhaustible Haydn. Through him it wishes once again to be united with somebody. With steady diligence you shall receive Mozart's spirit from Haydn's hands. Your true friend, Waldstein. Back to Mark Evans. Mark Evans Bonds. The long frustrated wishes were a sad fact. Beethoven had already traveled to Vienna once before, in early 1787, with the intention to study with Mozart. While it seems likely they met, there is no documentation to confirm this. That first visit to Vienna had in any case been cut short when Beethoven returned to Bonn to be by the side of his gravely ill mother, who died a few months later. Mozart himself died in December 1791, and so Beethoven turned instead to Haydn, who had himself only recently returned to Vienna from an extended and enormously successful sojourn in London. Why Vienna? It was widely known as one of the most musically vibrant cities in all of Europe, and Maximilian Franz's sponsorship of the young composer assured him of ready access to the city's aristocratic families who vied with one another to bestow their own patronage on promising young artists. With the exception of opera and sacred music, Vienna's music life in the 1790s took place largely behind closed doors. There were relatively few truly public concerts, and some of the more affluent aristocrats even maintained their own private orchestras. It was in these salons that Beethoven made his reputation as a composer, virtuoso performer, and above all, as an improviser on the piano. In a celebrated duel that took place in 1799, he and the pianist Josef Wolfl took turns improvising on themes each provided the other. Years later, the composer Ignaz von Seefried would recall that in his improvisations, even then, Beethoven did not deny his tendency toward the mysterious and gloomy, whereas Wolfl, trained in the school of Mozart, was always equable, never superficial but always clear, and thus more accessible to the multitude. The dedicatees of Beethoven's early works, this is my side note, I don't know if it's this episode with Josef Wolfl, but I do believe in this duel that Beethoven took one of Wolfl's variations, basically just did all sorts of complicated things about it, and Wolfl just basically left because he was just F this guy. He just He just like owned me, so he left. I believe that's the story of this duel. But anyways, back to the book. The dedicatees of Beethoven's early works reflect his ability to attract and cultivate powerful patrons. A composer could not presume to delegate a publication without the permission of the dedicatee. The dedicatee, in turn, was expected to reward the composer with a payment of some kind. A list of the patrons to whom Beethoven dedicated his published works during his first decade in Vienna reads like a who's who of the city's aristocracy. Princes and princesses, counts and countesses, barons and baronesses, and even the Empress herself, Mary Therese. Prince Karl Lichnowsky was especially generous. A serious music lover, he established a fund of 60 gulden annually on which Beethoven could draw until such time as he could secure a permanent salaried position. This was no small sum. One contemporary on the scene estimated in 1793 that an unmarried man could live modestly in Vienna on 775 gulden a year. And Beethoven had several other sources of income at the time, as well as through teaching, performing, and publishing. Beethoven also received lodging and food in the prince's household, even dining at the prince's table on a regular basis for a time. As a token of thanks, he dedicated a number of major works to Lichnowsky, most significantly the very first of his publications he deemed worthy of an opus number, the piano trios, Opus 1, and beyond that, the piano sonata in C minor, Opus 13, the Pathétique, the piano sonata in A-flat major, Opus 26, and the Second Symphony, Opus 36. The seemingly ideal arrangement of Lichnowsky created problems of its own, however. Am I supposed to come home daily at 3:30, change into better clothes, shave, etc.? I can't stand it, he declared to one of his friends. And indeed, the more firmly he established himself in Viennese society, the more frequently he refused entreaties to perform or improvise in the presence of others. This was the immediate cause of a major break with the prince in 1806, though the two eventually reconciled. Beethoven struggled all his life between the financial support he needed and the independence he craved. He was not a physically imposing figure. Friends and acquaintances recall him as stocky, muscular, and of roughly average height for his time, about 5'5". His sense of rhythm seems to have been entirely internal. Ferdinand Ries, a former student, would later recall that the composer was very clumsy and awkward in his movements. His gestures were totally lacking in grace. It is difficult to understand how he succeeded in shaving himself. He could never learn to dance in time. But he was not indifferent to fashion. Like most of his generation, he disdained wigs and wore his hair fairly short, an outward symbol of Republican sentiments. A year into his time in Vienna, he wrote to Eleanor von Breuning back in Bonn, requesting her to knit another waistcoat for him on the grounds that the one she has given him earlier was now so unfashionable that I can only keep it in my closet as something most dear to me from you. Quite aside from his problems with hearing, he complained frequently about his health. Gastrointestinal ailments plagued him constantly. The years took their toll, and when Englishman John Russell visited him in 1822, he described Beethoven's unpromising exterior in some detail. Here's his account. Though not an old man, he has lost to society in consequence of his extreme deafness, which has rendered him almost unsocial. The neglect of his person which he exhibits gives him a somewhat wild appearance. His features are strong and prominent. His eye is full of rude energy. His hair, which neither comb nor scissors seem to have visited for years, overshadows his broad brow in a quantity and confusion to which only the snakes round a gorgon's head offer a parallel. His general behavior does not ill accord with the unpromising exterior, except when he is among his closest friends. Kindliness and affability is not his characteristics. A total loss of hearing has deprived him of all the pleasure which society can give, and perhaps soured his temper. Back to Bonds. Nor was he known for his tidiness. One visitor to his two-room flat in 1809 described it as the dirtiest, most disorderly place imaginable, with moisture on the ceiling and an unemptied chamber pot underneath the piano. The chairs were covered with clothes and with dishes that bore the remains of last night's supper. He acknowledged his deafness for the first time in a letter to Wegler in 1801, but only because Wegler was born in Bonn and not in Vienna. Beethoven wanted his condition kept secret, but by the fall of 1802 he had come to realize that this was no longer possible. While seeking a cure at the spa village of Heiligstad, he wrote a long letter to his two brothers that gave voice to his despair. Intended to be read only after his death, the Heiligstad Testament is the central verbal document of Beethoven's life. He confessed that the pain of his deafness, both physical and social, was so great that he had contemplated suicide. "It was only art that kept me back," he declared. Committing his darkest thoughts to writing at this time seems to have had a cathartic effect. Soon afterward, he composed the monumental Eroica symphony, and over the next 10 years, he would go on to compose an astonishing number of masterpieces, including the 4th through 8th symphonies, the 4th and 5th piano concertos, the violin concerto, and the string quartets opus 59, 74, and 95, and his only completed opera, Fidelio. He completed all of these works, as well as many of his earlier ones, against the backdrop of war. When the French occupied the Rhineland in 1794, Maximilian Franz had fled to his family home in Vienna. But even there he was not safe from the reach of Napoleon, who would go on to occupy the city twice, first in 1805 without resistance, and then again in 1809 after a bombardment that sent Beethoven to a cellar, clutching pillows to his ears to lessen the pain of the cannon thunder. Which is kind of funny, because he should have been deaf by this time. It was around this time that Beethoven received an invitation from Napoleon's youngest brother, Jérôme, ruler of the newly formed Kingdom of Westphalia, to become music director at the court of Kassel. Beethoven leveraged this offer to secure a generous annuity funded by 3 Austrian patrons, Prince Lobkowitz, Prince Kinsky, and Archduke Rudolph, with the understanding that he would remain in Vienna. Beethoven experienced another pronounced deterioration of his hearing beginning around 1812, the year in which he became involved with a woman whose identity remains unknown, but whom he called his immortal beloved. The affair was brief but intense. We know of it only from a single letter he wrote to her, in which she at some point presumably returned to him. Along with the Heiligstad Testament, and this letter was discovered only after his death. The end of this affair, which presumably coincided with the return of the letter, appears to have shaken the composer deeply. He began to keep a diary of sorts shortly afterward, resorting to words once again to help him work through his thoughts at a time of personal crisis. This is not a diary in any conventional sense, but rather an unsystematic and occasional collection of jottings and observations, some of them personal, others mundane. It seems to have functioned as the verbal counterpart to the musical sketchbooks, a repository of ideas worthy of further consideration. The years 1813 to 15 saw a marked decline in both the quantity and quality of the music he composed. This may have been caused by accelerating deafness, his failed love affair, and some combination of the two. Paradoxically, he was enjoying unprecedented popular success at this moment. In the fall of 1814, leaders and diplomats from all over Europe assembled for the Congress of Vienna. and Beethoven's pocketbook and reputation benefited directly from the many concerts put on to entertain the city's well-heeled visitors. They were there to redraw the continent's boundaries in the wake of Napoleon's defeat. In the works such as Wellington's Victory and Der glorreiche Augenblick, The Glorious Moment, written in a more popular style than most of his other compositions, won wide critical praise at the time, even if subsequent critics have for the most part preferred to keep their distance from them. A new phase of Beethoven's life became shortly after the death of his brother Caspar Karl in November 1815, when he assumed joint legal guardianship of his brother's 9-year-old son Karl with the boy's mother Johanna. There were problems with this arrangement from the start. Beethoven considered his nephew's mother both morally and intellectually deficient, and the two guardians engaged in a nasty 5-year court battle over physical custody of the boy. Beethoven eventually prevailed. He carried out his paternal duties conscientiously and devoted countless hours to Karl's upbringing, but the youth's attempted suicide in August 1826 ultimately persuaded the composer to cede guardianship to Stefan von Breuning, who helped secure Karl an appointment in the army. In spite of these increased demands on his time and energy over the past decade of his life, Beethoven somehow managed to resume his earlier level of intense artistic creativity. Apollo and Muses will not yet deliver me to the Grim Reaper, he wrote to one of his publishers in 1824. For I still owe them a great deal, and before I depart for the Elysian fields, I must leave behind what the Spirit provides me and commands me to finish. It really seems to me as if I had written hardly any music at all. At this point, Beethoven was in fact in the middle of a 5-year span in which he would complete such monumental works as the Missa Solemnis, the Diabelli Variations, the Ninth Symphony, and the 5 late string quartets. But the Grim Reaper did finally call in March 1827. The autopsy report suggests any number of possible causes of death, most of them involving his liver, kidneys, spleen, and pancreas. Franz Grillparzer, one of Austria's leading literary figures, wrote the funeral oration. A noted actor of the time declaimed it, and tens of thousands turned out to witness the procession. Who shall arise to stand beside him? Grillparzer asked. The question remains as relevant today. Chapter 3. Ideals. Ideals have a way of colliding with reality in every life. In Beethoven's case, the distance between the two was more extreme than most, the collision more severe. His ideals, the principles by which he lived, grew out of a mixture of religious, ethical, and philosophical beliefs. His reality was the need to earn a living in a world of sound. His reality was the need to earn a living in a world of sound he was increasingly unable to hear. For Beethoven, the one ideal that dominated all others was self-cultivation, or as the German term would have it, Bildung. The imperative to develop and realize one's fullest potential, obvious as it may seem to us today, was by no means self-evident in Beethoven's time. His generation, in fact, witnessed a momentous change in the very conception of the self. The idea of Bildung compelled individuals to explore and exploit those aspects of the self that lay beneath consciousness and apart from the social positions into which they had been born. Its novelty lay not in the belief that each person is unique, but rather that this uniqueness could be cultivated. The term individualism was in itself an invention of the early 19th century. Beethoven embraced this new sense of self. His correspondence, the Helgestad Testament, and his diary all bear witness to a lifelong effort to articulate his vision of what he could become and what he could accomplish. In spite of an only rudimentary formal education, he read widely and was determined to grasp the import of the better and wiser individuals of each age. Quotations and allusions sprinkled throughout his correspondence reveal a more than passing acquaintance of such authors as Homer, Plutarch, Shakespeare, Calderon, Herder, Goethe, and Schiller. A French officer who visited him on several occasions in the fall of 1809 reported that the two conversed about philosophy, religion, politics, and especially of Shakespeare, his idol. But Bildung was more than knowledge or even self-knowledge. It was above all about the purpose of one's life. Beethoven was aware of his extraordinary musical gifts and saw their realization as his calling. This sense of mission lay at the core of his being and recurs throughout his writings. Anything that impeded his realization of this goal was to be resisted at all costs. Fulfillment of this mission, moreover, required sacrifice. Beethoven recognized that he could achieve his fullest potential only at the cost of foregoing the ordinary pleasures of life, including love. The very first entry of the diary he began to keep in the late 1812, shortly after the end of his affair with the immortal beloved, reads, "You must not be a human being, not for yourself, but only for others. For you there is no longer any happiness except within yourself and your art. O God, give me strength to conquer myself. Nothing at all must fetter me to life." I'm going to read that quote again because it's quite striking. So he says to himself, "You must not be a human being, not for yourself, but only for others. For you, there is no longer any happiness except within yourself, in your art. O God, give me the strength to conquer myself. Nothing at all must fetter me in life." As if to underscore the centrality of artistic creation in his life, the diary's very next entry reflects on the finer points of voice leading. The precise coinciding of several musical notes generally hinders the progression from one to the other. Despair returns with the diary's third entry. "O terrible circumstances which do not suppress any longer for domesticity, but prevent its realization. O God, look down upon the unhappy bee. Do not let it continue like this any longer." The back and forth of these opening three entries, from the personal to the technical and back to the personal, captures the inseparability of Beethoven's perspective on life and music. Only this divine art, as he put it in 1824, gave him the lever and the power to sacrifice to the heavenly muses the best part of my life. End quote. Maybe I should be saying begin quote and end quote. There are a lot of quotes in here. He peppered his diary with self-admonitions to forego earthly pleasures for the cause of art. Here's a snippet. "There is much to be done on earth. Do it soon. I must not continue my present everyday life. Art demands this sacrifice too. Rest and find diversion only in order to act all the more forcefully in art. If possible, bring the ear trumpets to perfection and then travel. This you owe to yourself, to mankind, and to Him, the Almighty. Only thus can you once again develop everything that has to remain locked within you. Live only in your art, no matter how limited you are by your senses. This is nevertheless the only existence for you. Sacrifice yet again all the trivialities of social life to your art, O God above all." Back to Bonds. For Beethoven, art was both a manifestation of the divine and a means by which to approach the divine. He encouraged a young musical admirer not only to practice her art, but to penetrate its interior, for only art and science elevate mankind to the deity. He made much the same point years later when he wished one of his publishers every good success for your efforts on behalf of art, for it is only art and science, after all, that point to a higher life and give us hope for it. Beethoven was scarcely alone in regarding art as a form of religion. German speakers of the time even coined a word for it, Kunstreligion, or art religion. By this line of thought, art provided a glimpse of a higher realm beyond the travails of earthly life. And instrumental music, because of its inherently abstract nature, lent itself particularly well to providing intimations of a higher form of existence. Free from the burden of representation and the strictures of language, instrumental music had the capacity to convey what words could not. The poet and dramatist Ludwig Tieck, for example, an acquaintance of the composer, declared the modern symphony to be capable of delivering us to a quiet, happy, peaceful land. And E.T.A. Hoffmann received in Beethoven's Fifth Symphony a wondrous spirit realm of the infinite. Art religion did not supplant the teachings of the Church, but supplemented them. Beethoven was born into the Catholic faith, and while he was not particularly observant of ritual, he took the last rites on his deathbed and never expressed the slightest doubt in the existence of a higher power. He regarded Christ as a model of Stoicism, and the repeated references and appeals to God in his correspondence rarely came across as formulaic. He considered entrusting his nephew Karl to the care of the noted Catholic theologian and Bishop Johann Michael Saylor, and annotated heavily his own copy of Christoph Christian Sturm's Reflections on the Works of God in the Realm of Nature, a treatise that expounded at length on the reconciliation of science and religion. But faith for Beethoven went well beyond the Church. He seized on any number of belief systems that might help him establish spiritual and ethical coordinates. These included not only Catholicism, but also Freemasonry, tenets of various Eastern religions, and pantheism. We should not parse these too closely. He took from each what he found most helpful. Freemasonry placed special value on the ideal of brotherhood. Beethoven never joined a lodge, for by the time he arrived in Vienna, the golden age of Freemasonry in the imperial city had passed. The order had flourished under the rule of Joseph II in the 1780s, and Mozart and Haydn had both been members. But in the wake of the French Revolution, Emperor Franz II disbanded the lodges on the suspicion that they encouraged revolution, and the movement went underground. Beethoven was nevertheless deeply sympathetic to its basic principles: an obligation to improve oneself, endurance in the face of suffering, and above all, the conviction that deeds counted for more than the accident of one's social standing at birth. His network of Viennese friends, patrons, and publishers included many who had previously been active Freemasons, and his correspondence is full of catchphrases that may well have carried Masonic overtones as their recipients. Masonic overtones for their recipients. In one particularly curious entry in his diary, Beethoven equates the year 1816 with 5816, an assertion that resonates with the Masonic belief that the world had been created in 4000 BCE. Eastern religions, the distant and in many respects imagined basis for many Masonic doctrine, provided another source of ethical ideals, particularly those associated with Stoicism, renunciation, and self-overcoming. Beethoven's engagement with Hindu, Vedantic, and Brahmin writings were part of a broader European fascination with Eastern texts that were then translated and made available for the first time in the West. The diary contains a number of transcriptions from sacred texts, as well as commentaries taken from various German language books on Eastern religions. Beethoven was also deeply sympathetic to the idea of pantheism. Nature was for him yet another manifestation of God's presence in the physical world, and as such a source of mystical insight. In The Countryman, he mused it was as if every tree spoke to me, holy, holy. In The Forest, enchantment. Who can express it all? On another occasion, he claimed that no one can love the countryside as much as I do, for the forest, trees, and rocks produce the resonance mankind desires. That resonance found its own expression in the Pastoral Symphony. That's why I think it's the best symphony, y'all. Beethoven believed in faith, something never far from his mind. He spoke of it repeatedly in his correspondence and in his diary, always with a sense of reverence. It is never God's will, but rather something more akin to the ancient Greek concept of an impersonal force, sometimes administered by the gods, sometimes not. Fate plays a major role in the epic poems Iliad and Odyssey, and Beethoven seems to have appropriated the attitudes of their lead characters as his own. He copied out in his diary the cry of the mortally wounded Hector from Book 22 of the Iliad. But now fate catches me. Let me not sink into the dust unresisting and inglorious, but first accomplish great things of which future generations too shall hear. The passage is eerily similar to what Beethoven himself had written in the Heiligenstadt Testament of 1802, in which he confessed to having contemplated suicide in the face of growing deafness, but declared that he had held back on the grounds that it seemed to me impossible to leave the world before having produced everything I felt called upon to bring forth. Deafness was an agent of fate. Beethoven accepted it, but not without a struggle. When he confessed his condition to Regler in 1801, he vowed to grab fate by the throat. It shall certainly not break me completely. He spent years seeking a cure and ultimately concluded that his only option short of suicide was resignation. He called it a wretched means of refuge, but embraced it because it was the only path by which he could pursue his art. That, in the end, would remain the highest form of self-development, and as such, his highest ideal. All right, that's it for chapters 2 and 3. The next one is about his deafness, so I hope y'all stay tuned for that. Phew. Hot in there. I was losing a little bit of focus, so I wasn't reading so well because it was a little hot, and I was trying to make sure I wasn't moving so much, but we'll see. I'll have to change the setup a bit more, but hopefully the audio is better. Cool. Check you all in chapter 4.